The more things change, does connecting the world actually make it better? In 1476, about 2 decades after the publication of the Gutenberg Bible, a merchant named William Caxton built Britain's first printing press in a building near Westminster Abbey. William Caxton, the first printing press in Britain. The following year, he used it to publish a book, one of the first ever mass printed in English, called, quote, The Dictes and Sayings of the Philosophers, close quote. Parenthetically, the title was redundant. Dictes and sayings are the same thing. The book was a translation of a French anthology, which was a translation of a Latin anthology, which was a translation of a Spanish anthology, which was a translation of an Arabic anthology that had been transcribed from oral tradition in the 11th century Egypt. The Dictes was what classicists called a doxography, a chapter-by-chapter list of ancient thinkers and what they said, or what they were said to have said, a doxography. The chapter on Socrates, for example, included a brief summary of his life and death, a few descriptive details, quote, when he spake, he wagged his little finger, close quote, and a recitation of his various opinions, including his opinion that philosophy should only be transmitted orally, not through books. Many of the Dictes were mystical aphorisms, quote, thought is the mirror of man, wherein he may behold his beauty and his filth, close quote. Or alarmist diet to me to the soul, and is like setting fire to fire, close quote. Or paeans to a deity who was made to sound blandly, anachronistically Christian. Pythagoras, it was reported, instructed his followers, quote, to serve God, close quote. Omitted was the fact that Pythagoras was a pagan who believed in reincarnation and occult numerology. Still, at least Pythagoras was a real person. Some of the other philosophers in the Dictes, such as Zalquinus and Tac, spelled T-A-C, probably never existed at all. As it turns out, the whole volume, instead of placing it in its original context in the Socrates chapter, he put it in the middle of his epilogue, as if to quarantine it. As soon as he had made his decision, he attempted to rationalize it. In the rest of the epilogue, he seemed to imply that he wasn't a gatekeeper after all, that although he was clearly a publisher, his printing press should be treated more like a platform. He was merely serving his customers, he suggested. They deserved to hear all perspectives and to make up their own minds. Besides, anyone who was offended should blame Socrates, not Caxton. Better yet, a reader who disliked the passage could, quote, with a pen race it out, or else rend the leaf out of the book, close quote. The one viewer is gone. In the 20th century, as early packet switching networks evolved into the internet, a generation of futurists and TED talkers emerged, explaining the new system to the laity in a spirit of wide-eyed techno-utopianism. They compared it to a superhighway, to a marketplace of ideas, to a printing press. Anyone who was spending a lot of time on the internet knew that many parts of it felt more like a dingy flea market, or like a parking lot outside a bar the moment before a fight breaks out. The techno-utopians must have been aware of those parts too, but they didn't mention them often. In 1998, James Dewar, a policy analyst at the Rand Corporation, wrote a paper called The Information Age and the Printing Press, Looking Backward to See Ahead. James Dewar, 1998. He had a rosy view of the past, and he extrapolated this into hopeful speculation about the future. The printing press has been implicated in the Reformation, the Renaissance, and the Scientific Revolution, he wrote. Quote, similarly, profound changes may already be underway in the information age, close quote. Near the end of the paper, he acknowledged that, quote, we are already seeing some of the dark side of networked computers, close quote. He listed a few examples in bullet point form, quote, new and interesting ways of breaking into computer systems, quote, chain letters that are both illegal and bandwidth sensitive, quote, trollers are posting to news groups, close quote. This is 1998. Yet this brief qualification, which appeared in a section called Afterthoughts, seemed perfunctory at best. It had no effect on Dewar's sweeping, optimistic conclusion that it was, quote, more important to explore the upside of the technology than to protect us against the downside. And thus, quote, the internet should remain unregulated, close quote. In the ensuing decade, a few nerdy young men created a handful of fast-growing social networks. MySpace, Twitter, Reddit, Facebook. They didn't pretend to know exactly how social media would be used, and they gave even less thought to how it might be misused. Despite Caxton's self-justifications, subsequent generations of printers had grown to understand themselves as gatekeepers, and publishing had become an industry defined as much by what it didn't publish as by what it did. In the new industry of social media, the default setting was reversed. Founders vowed to keep their platforms, quote, content neutral, close quote. The assumption was that almost all voices, even odious ones, deserved the chance to be amplified. Steve Huffman, the co-founder and CEO of Reddit, told me that in high school he learned, quote, about Gutenberg, Martin Luther, the democratization of knowledge and power. It was deeply ingrained in me that freedom of expression is important, close quote. Naturally, he moderated the speech on Reddit as minimally as possible. Quote, in the early days, we considered ourselves the anti-gatekeepers, the liberators, close quote, Huffman told me. Open quote, everyone's feeling, including mine at the time, was trust your users, let them post what they want to post. If it's bad, it'll get downvoted, close quote. For centuries, the meaning of free speech had been refined and reinterpreted in universities, in legislatures, in the courts, in the press. In the early days of Silicon Valley, however, weighty decisions about free speech were more likely to be made in the course of an afternoon in a cramped conference room full of complimentary snacks by a small team of harried computer engineers. Often they had no long-term plan other than hacking together a, quote, minimum viable product, quote, shipping, quote, close quote, their code as quickly as possible, and then, quote, iterating, startup euphemisms for what was essentially trial and error. Quote, I remember thinking people in government on the Supreme Court are way smarter than me, Huffman said, open quote. So if something's not illegal to say under U.S. law, why should I make it illegal to say on Reddit, close quote. In 2012, shortly before Facebook went public, one of its SEC filings included an open letter signed by Mark Zuckerberg, the company's founder and CEO. I have a printed copy of that. I remember when he did this. I printed it out in the studio, and it's in one of these suitcases, which is crazy. In 2012, shortly before Facebook went public, one of its SEC filings included an open letter signed by Mark Zuckerberg, the company's founder and CEO. Since Facebook's launch in 2004, Zuckerberg had portrayed himself as a Robin Hood figure, snatching power from the gatekeepers and redistributing it to the people. In the letter, he claimed that around Facebook's open plan office, quote, we often talk about inventions like the printing press and the television. By simply making communication more efficient, they led to a complete transformation of many important parts of society. They encouraged progress. They changed the way society was organized. They brought us closer together, close quote. This wasn't entirely wrong, but it left out a lot. Still, in fairness to Zuckerberg, he was merely echoing what has long been the dominant narrative about the history of technology, the triumphalist one. Until recently, Zuckerberg insisted that Facebook was a platform, not a publisher. If some disgruntled teenager wanted to quote Socrates' vituperative opinions about women, or if, for that matter, a teenager wanted to share his own vituperative opinions, then who was Zuckerberg to stand in the way? In 2016, a few hours after a private audience with the Pope, Zuckerberg hosted a public question and answer event in Rome. He was asked whether he saw himself as an editor. Quote, no, he said, tittering uncomfortably. Quote, we build tools. We do not produce content, close quote. In some settings, he tried to absolve himself of decision-making power. In others, he acknowledged his power, but framed his actions as inherently noble, implying that the freedom to share opinions online was akin to a human right. Sometimes he deployed several dodges, one after another, in the tradition of William Caxton. Information wants to be free. Besides, people who take offense should blame the author, not the messenger. Anyway, the ultimate responsibility lies with each individual reader. Many early social media entrepreneurs went to college to study computer science or business, receiving a respect for free speech principles via cultural osmosis. Others didn't finish college at all. One of the few who has read widely in the humanities is Chris Hughes, who was Mark Zuckerberg's roommate at Harvard before becoming one of Facebook's first employees. Quote, there was a strong sense back then, certainly you heard it from Mark and the people around him, that wiring the world was good in and of itself, close quote. Hughes said recently, quote, there was a widespread belief in the inevitable forward march of history. I don't know that that came from books or from anywhere in particular. I think it was just understood, close quote. Most people in Silicon Valley wanted to change the world. They didn't bother specifying that they wanted to change it for the better. That part was implied. And besides, it was supposed to happen more or less automatically. Quote, I remember a ton of conversation in which the introduction of our tools was compared to the advent of the hammer or the light bulb. Hughes went on, open quote, we could have compared it to a weapon, too, I suppose, but nobody did, close quote. That makes me think that someone has now done that in a way. Not really a weapon, but he clearly talks about how it has been used as a weapon in his book, Siva Vaidyanathan's book. Again, I must recommend it to you. The Printing Press as an Agent of Change is a book published in 1979 by the historian Elizabeth Eisenstein. It is the seminal account, more than 700 pages long, of how mass printing, in Francis Bacon's phrase, quote, altered the face and state of the world, close quote. Eisenstein is a thorough scholar, and she is dutiful about lodging the necessary caveats. She acknowledges that many early printers were driven, at least in part, by the profit motive, and that much of what they printed was disinformation or propaganda. Still, even when noting such drawbacks, she tends to couch them in a narrative of redemption. She argues, for example, that many, quote, fraudulent esoteric writings, close quote, were ultimately, quote, paving the way for a purification of Christian sources later on. Here, as elsewhere, there is a need to distinguish between initial and delayed effects, close quote. She makes similar claims at other points in the book, downplaying initial effects in favor of taking the long view, even though initial effects of the printing press included heightened ethnic tensions, the spread of medical misinformation, and about a century's worth of European religious wars. In other words, even when early printing technology ought to be described as a weapon, Eisenstein treats it more like a light bulb. Quote, the advent of printing, Eisenstein writes, quote, provided the stroke of magic by which an obscure theologian in Wittenberg managed to shake St. Peter's throne, close quote. The theologian, of course, is Martin Luther. Eisenstein recounts the viral dissemination of Luther's 95 Theses in some detail. Nowhere, however, does she mention one of Luther's later works, a treatise called On the Jews and Their Lies. Quote, we are at fault in not slaying them, Luther writes, quote, I shall give you my sincere advice. First, to set fire to their synagogues or schools. Second, I advise that their houses also be razed and destroyed, close quote. It goes on with an avidity that was shocking even by the standards of the time. Luther's swan song, published in the year of his death, was a pamphlet called Warning Against the Jews. Luther was not content with verbal abuse, Paul Johnson writes in, quote, A History of the Jews. Quote, he got Jews expelled from Saxony in 1537, and in the 1540s he drove them from many German towns, close quote. Johnson adds that Luther's followers, quote, sacked the Berlin synagogue in 1572, and the following year finally got their way, quote, when the Jews were banned from the entire region. If mass printing was the quote the spark of magic that helped Luther catalyze the Reformation, then it was also the megaphone that enabled anti-Semites to shout fire in the crowded theater of Western Europe. According to Johnson, quote, On the Jews and Their Lies, the book was, quote, the first work of modern anti-Semitism and a giant step forward on the road to the Holocaust, close quote. If mass printing was the spark of magic that helped Luther catalyze the Reformation, then it was also the megaphone that enabled anti-Semites to shout fire in the crowded theater of Western Europe, is a great line. William Caxton introduced more than 1,000 words into the English language, including concussion, voyager, and servitude. Another word that didn't exist at the time is Islamophobia, which can now be used anachronistically to describe Caxton's geopolitical proclivities. In fact, such a description would be an understatement. In 1481, Caxton published Godefroy of Boulogne, or The Siege and Conquest of Jerusalem. The book, he explained in an epilogue, had been translated and reduced out of French into English by me, simple person William Caxton, to the end that every Christian man may be better encouraged to enterprise war for the defense of Christendom. Close quote. He actually wrote French, F-F-R-E-N-S-S-H-E, and Tenterprise, but some of his spellings have been standardized here for the sake of legibility. Godefroy was an 11th century crusader who led Christian armies through Nicaea and Constantinople and into Jerusalem, slaughtering as many Muslims as he could find. In 1481, the Ottoman Empire was expanding toward Jerusalem. Caxton hoped that by recounting romantic tales of the First Crusade, he could inspire his contemporaries, quote, with strong hand to expel the Saracens and Turks out of the same, that our Lord might be there served and worshipped of his chosen Christian people, close quote. So much for content neutrality. This is all a matter of recondite academic debate until it isn't. Let's say it's 2004 or 2005, and you're about to start a social media company. Bandwidth is cheap. Venture capital abounds. Legislators don't understand your business model well enough to regulate it, and the public isn't really paying attention. You can do pretty much whatever you want. So what do? If you believe wholeheartedly in the inevitable march of progress, if you have no doubt that any communication tool you bestow upon the masses will be used as a light bulb and not as a weapon, then there will be no countervailing force checking your reckless optimism, not to mention your rapacity. If, however, you take the downside risk more seriously, if it crosses your mind that your nifty new light bulb could, say, cause a few liberal democracies to lurch forward toward tyranny, exacerbate an already acute climate crisis, and heighten nuclear tensions, then you might proceed with a bit more caution. In 2003, a 15-year-old named Christopher Poole created an image board called 4chan, which was built on the principles of anonymity and unrestrained free speech. It grew into a repository for some of the worst that the internet had to offer. Florid racism, violent pornography, screeds from the cohort of misogynists now known as incels, that's I-N-C-E-L, now known as incels. Poole was later hired by Google. When Poole started banning some of the most egregious 4chan posts, images that verged on child pornography, for example, many users saw this as a violation of their free speech rights. One such user was Frederick Brennan. In 2013, high on mushrooms, Brennan decided to create 8chan. He conceived it as an alternative to 4chan, one with an even stauncher commitment to anything goes content moderation. Pretty quickly, 8chan became like 4chan, only worse. Recently on Vice News, Brennan called 8chan, quote, the butthole of the internet, close quote. In an interview with me, he called it, quote, horrifying and depressing, close quote. This year, 3 acts of white supremacist terrorism, armed attacks on a synagogue in Poway, California, on 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, and on a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, had been committed by young men who said they had been radicalized on 8chan. Quote, you build this thing with good intentions, believing that you're about to change the world, and then you watch as the body count ticks up to, what is it now, 71, close quote, Brennan said. Open quote, it's like a nightmare. Brennan, who lives in the Philippines, left 8chan in 2016. He now builds software for typeface designers. The site's current owner, Jim Watkins, an American who also lives in the Philippines, has done essentially nothing to rein in the chaos. Quote, Jim seems to think it's all fun and games, close quote, Brennan told me. In August, Watkins was subpoenaed by the House Committee on Homeland Security, and this month, he flew to Washington to give closed-door testimony. In his prepared remarks, he wrote, quote, my company has no intention of deleting constitutionally protected hate speech, close quote. Brennan told me, quote, if I could, I'd delete 8chan in a second. It's way beyond the point of no return, close quote. In recent years, Steve Huffman of Reddit has modified his early approach to content moderation. Quote, it's one thing to go, we should never ban anything, he said. It's another thing to watch a community use your platform for something that's obviously harmful and think, okay, can we actually justify doing nothing about this? Close quote. In 2016, Reddit's administrators banned a subreddit devoted to the Pizzagate conspiracy theory. In 2018, they banned a subreddit devoted to the QAnon conspiracy theory. In June, they censured The Donald, a popular pro-Trump subreddit, after several of its members called for armed uprisings in progressive cities such as Portland, Oregon. Huffman told me, quote, "I still think the spread of information through technology has been overwhelmingly positive, but I no longer believe, like I did 14 years ago, that the negative side effects will disappear by themselves. What we've learned, sometimes the hard way, is that it takes a ton of work," close quote. After more than a decade, the most powerful social media entrepreneurs, now businessmen in their 30s, finally seem to understand that their imagined techno-utopia is not going to materialize. This realization may be a sign of maturity. It may be a calculated response to internal pressure from investors or a strategy to stave off regulation. Or it may be a simple defense mechanism, a reaction to being shamed. Within just a few years, the general public's attitude towards social media has swerved from widespread veneration to viral fury. This may be one of the few silver linings of the 2016 election. Had Hillary Clinton been elected, as most people expected, it's unlikely that social media founders would now have as much to reckon with what they've wrought. In November 2018, Mark Zuckerberg posted a note on his Facebook profile, quote, "Many of us got into technology because we believe it can be a democratizing force for putting power in people's hands," he wrote. Quote, "I believe the world is better when more people have a voice to share their experiences and when traditional gatekeepers like governments and media companies don't control what ideas can be expressed," close quote. He announced that he would set up, quote, "an independent body," close quote, "to hear appeals from users who felt that their speech had been unfairly suppressed or that they'd been insufficiently protected from harassment. The idea seemed to be that Zuckerberg, who once rejected the idea that fake news affected the 2016 election and who has referred to Holocaust denialism as merely something, quote, "that different people get wrong," close quote, should not be entrusted with sole gatekeeping authority over one of the most influential institutions on earth. The independent board, now nicknamed, quote, "the Supreme Court of Facebook," close quote, is expected to begin its work next year. Since it was announced, its brief has expanded. In addition to resolving conflicts, the board's decisions will help Facebook develop a coherent approach to content moderation in general. Last week, Facebook released an 8-page charter outlining the board's intentions, a detailed flowchart illustrating how it will make decisions, and a new message from Zuckerberg reaffirming his commitment. Quote, "The board's decision will be binding, even if I or anyone at Facebook disagrees with it," close quote. Kate Klonick, an internet law scholar and a professor at St. John's University, has been allowed to observe more than 100 hours of internal meetings at Facebook, meetings about what this new body should do, who should be on it, what powers it should have. She described the process as, quote, "manically thoughtful," close quote. Open quote, "It's sort of like setting up Article 3 courts entirely from scratch," close quote, she told me, referring to the part of the U.S. Constitution that enumerates the powers of the judicial branch. Quote, "Except if you're Facebook, you don't have an Article 3 because you don't have a constitution," which raises the question, well, okay, should we write a constitution? If so, what should be in it? Close quote. In the end, she continued, quote, "It's hard to know whether this will be adequate or not, but I can promise there has never been such an enormous concerted voluntary effort by a private company to jettison part of its power over a public right in human history," close quote. Zuckerberg hasn't abandoned his techno-utopianism. His claim that the post-Facebook world, quote, "is better," close quote, as he put it in his note in November, is arguable at best, but his self-assurance has clearly been punctured. Quote, "The past 2 years have shown that without sufficient safeguards, people will misuse these tools to interfere in elections, spread misinformation, and incite violence. One of the most painful lessons I've learned is that when you connect 2 billion people, you will see all the beauty and ugliness of humanity," close quote. Wow. That's exactly like the quote he opened with in the 1500s, right? As of last week, the note had received 41,000 likes, Zuckerberg's note, 4,000 loves, 856 surprised emojis, 252 laughing emojis, 158 angry emojis, 81 crying emojis, and more than 7,000 comments. Quote, "Keep up the good work," close quote. A stock trader in Michigan wrote, open quote, ignore the media, keep improving, close quote. Open quote, please address the issue of fake ads, close quote, a man in Benin wrote. A German woman wrote, quote, any concept, however sophisticated, will somehow purposely be misused and abused, close quote. You suck, Zuckerberg, a British woman wrote. Open quote, let me guess, a woman in Washington state wrote, open quote, you guys never really thought of how explosive free speech really was, did ya? Pretty good comment there. So that was this piece in its entirety. I'll put the link to it in the description. The piece is called The More Things Change, and it's by Andrew Marantz. It's the critic at large section of this week's New Yorker, which again, I encourage you all to subscribe. It's the president's a moron, and it's a really, some issues are great. This current issue is really good. You know, we started the show talking about what I like and don't like about the magazines and so on. And yeah, there's some issues I just don't like. And they're all about fashion, and I'm not into fashion, or they're about whatever. But some issues are really awesome, and the current issue of the New Yorker is quite good. So that's MTK's promotion of that, and the promotion once again of the book by Dr. Siva Vaidyanathan, the director of the Media Center at the University of Virginia, the only book, academic work that addresses Facebook in its entirety and properly, published by Oxford Press. Go out and get yourself a copy. Anti-social media, how Facebook disconnects us and undermines democracy, by Dr. Siva Vaidyanathan. All right, thanks for joining me today. I see there's a viewer. Hi, viewer. Thanks for joining me for any part of that you joined me for. Bye, viewer.